I think few highlights. One, first is basically about the quality of the teachers. According to World Bank, over 50% of our teachers are not qualified for teaching.
But the other thing which is also good about, some of the things which has happened in India over years is that the focus on education has always been around learning English language.
There is a significant decline in terms of their students' motivation. People feel like, why am I studying? Because later on, it's not gonna be tested at the exams, or what's the point of me studying this? Because after all, when I want to go to high school, there's no gonna be I'm not gonna be seen based on how I'm performing at school, but based on how old I am and where I live from the, how far I live from the schools, right?
Hello everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for being here and thank you for inviting me to this summit. I'd like to take a quick few minutes to just give a quick background and introduction about myself, just to represent it through some quick slides. My name is Nilesh Zaveri. Yeah. So for the past 20 years or so, I've been living in Singapore and Hong Kong. Currently live in Singapore, where most of my professional life has been, but I'm not originally from there. And moving to the next slide. I was born in Mumbai, India, which probably you guys know a lot about. And this picture depicts clearly what India represents. There's a lot of people there in India. And kind of related to the topic today, which we're talking about education, I wanted to just bring a fact about when you're coming from a place where there is so much competition and little opportunities or less opportunities, what do you do how to make a difference? And what has been the defining part of my career? Which is the next one. And I think these are the three quick things for me which have stood out. And obviously one is education, which is really, really important for everyone. It does not guarantee anything, but obviously it provides you access and also an opportunity to be a little bit in the front of the queue. And along with that, hard work, obviously, is very important, and a little bit of good luck as well. To the next one. Over my sort of professional life, I've been in media and finance industry for about 25 years, working through some of the amazing brands here, which you might have seen or heard before. Star TV, News Corp, Fox, which is part of the big group itself, ESPN, Star Sports, Discovery, and most recently with Vice Media as well. So it's been such a great experience which I've had over so many years working in India first and then in Hong Kong and Singapore. To the next one. I just want to close with the last slide here. Next, please. Yeah, and I would say that I love Indonesia. Saya cinta Indonesia is what am I? I just love everything about this country, people, food, culture, everything. So much that my wife is Indonesian and my kids have Indonesian citizens. So, yeah, that's it. Look forward to having more discussion later.
Iman Usman adalah seorang pengusaha, penulis, dan produser film. Bersama sahabatnya, Belva Devara, Iman mendirikan Ruang Guru dan membawa Ruang Guru berkembang menjadi perusahaan penyedia layanan pendidikan terbesar di Asia Tenggara. Iman lulus S1 dengan gelar cum laude dari Universitas Indonesia di bidang hubungan internasional dan memperoleh gelar mahasiswa berprestasi terbaik 1 tingkat nasional. Iman melanjutkan studi S2-nya dengan beasiswa penuh di bidang pendidikan di Columbia University dan Harvard University di Amerika Serikat dengan predikat summa cum laude. Untuk berbagai kontribusinya di bidang pendidikan, Iman telah memperoleh berbagai penghargaan global seperti dari MIT, PBB, majalah Forbes, dan lainnya.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Iman. I'm co-founder and COO of Ruang Guru. To give a bit of context about what we're going to discuss, okay, so I think everybody here knows that we have one of the largest education systems globally. We have over 40 million students, 4 million teachers, 300,000 schools across the country, which makes us become the fourth largest education systems globally, so after China, India, and then the US. But we're also one of the lowest performing. And that is why in 2014, Belfa, my co-founder, my best friend, and I started Ruang Guru. Ruang Guru is a tech-enabled education provider. Essentially what we're doing is that we try to utilize and leverage quality content in education and combine it with the use of data so that the content can be delivered in a personalized way to the students. And we do that through so many different approaches. So it's not just a typical learning content where teachers teaching in front of the classrooms and then having their videos being recorded, but also using animations, using motion graphics. So it's very like the way like TV or other media, conventional media, deliver their content. And we've been doing that for about 10 years now. And beyond the content, then naturally we also develop other tools like learning management system, our own website, our own applications, and not only in K-12, but then along the way, we also kind of like expanded our services to lifelong learning too. So now we have services for upskilling, reskilling, corporate training, and then beyond the obvious subjects like math, now we have coding, we have arts, STEM obviously, and so many other things that we're doing. So this is just one of the graph, I think, that sort of like kind of like showcases where we are and what we're doing across different verticals, across different target audience. And I think beyond all this thing that we're doing, one thing that we also believe is that as an education company, or basically as an education organization, right, we realize that we cannot solve so many education problems that we have in this country by ourselves. That's why we need more people to basically get involved and be part of this movement. And that is why since the inception of the company, I think one thing that we did quite differently is that we produce a lot of different things, from movies, from variety shows, concerts, game shows, you name it. And one of the things that we produced recently was Class of Champions. I hope everyone has seen this. So Class of Champions is basically an intelligent game show. There are about 11 episodes that was aired for about 2 months. 50 students from all over the country and also like from universities globally were basically competing to become the ultimate champion. And in every single episode, there's a different challenge from, like numerical, memorization, logic, and many other things. And one thing that we were glad, when we're doing this is that because we didn't really expect, how it's going to turn out. Because every time we pitch about education show, usually people have a skepticism about it. But turns out it's received quite well. So over 11 episodes that we aired, we have, I think, over 100 million views, which I think makes Class of Champions become, I think, one of the most watched game show in the country this year. And I think beyond all of that, I think, next slide. Yeah. This is just to showcase how, like a game show can basically have a larger impact beyond just an entertainment. So we see how, like the games, the tools that we're using at the game being applied at the school, or basically creates a new spirit of learning, motivate the students and teachers to basically find an interesting and attractive way to deliver their learning modules. And this is not just within our target audience, but also even beyond that. So we see, even people at the workplace become more excited to chase their dreams, to basically think about pursuing continuing studies and so on and so forth. I think that's what we're trying to do. So this is just to give a bit of context of the conversations that we're going to have today, and hopefully we'll be able to learn something today. Thank you.
So just to sort of kickstart this session, so I'm going to be leading the discussion here with with Iman Usman, and we're going to be discussing about the innovative strategies in education and media. We've got a few topics to talk through, just going through basically a bunch of sort of topics around perspective of education, media, how does that play, comparison with some other countries as well, and we'll kind of go through each point by point. So the first topic which we have here is essentially just kind of assessing what is the current perspective of education and media. What's the public perception of education in Indonesia, and evaluating the role of media in shaping public perception and its contribution to the national development?
I think, thank you for the question. So I think everybody, or most of the people here, I think, believe that education is a key to social mobility. So people believe that, well, if meritocracy still exists, people believe that, like if you have basically good quality education, then eventually, like it will open new job and opportunities for you so that you will be able to move up to, like a better social ladder. So I think that's sort of like a general perception. So therefore, I think, I think there's some similarities between India and Indonesia in this case, where no matter where you come from, like you will try to basically allocate your family funds for education. So I think there is that similar situation here. However, I think challenge also persists. So like what I mentioned before, despite having one of the largest education systems globally, we also encounter so many challenges. And this is basically has been like the case like for so many different years. I think a few highlights. One, first is basically about the quality of the teachers. So according to World Bank, over 50% of our teachers are not qualified for teaching. And this might be surprising for some, but even if you look at like the National Teacher Competency Test, where basically teachers are being assessed for their performance or their knowledge or competence in the subject that they're teaching, the majority of our teachers basically didn't pass the test. So imagine, like a math teacher teaching math, but that teacher alone basically doesn't meet the passing grade for math. So that's where the problem is, right? So that's the first one. Second, even if there is quality teacher, the distribution is also not even. So there is a big disparity. There's a big gap between big cities and smaller cities. So if you look at the student-teacher ratio, our student-teacher ratio is actually pretty good. I think like it's 1 out of 20. But if you kind of like, think and do like a flashback to where you were at school, have you ever had an experience of having a student-teacher ratio 120 in the classrooms? I never had. I've always been in public school, and I think at least I had like one teacher per like 40 students or 43 students, right? So that just shows basically like how uneven the distribution is. And I think last but not least is also how the dropout that is still very, very high. So if you look at gross enrollment rate, basically the number of students who are enrolling in the school is actually pretty good. But the challenge is actually on the dropout. And the dropout is even basically higher when they basically graduate like from a specific level of education. So let's say SD, gitu ya, when they graduate from, maybe like the enrollment to SD is pretty good, the primary school is good, but then when they graduate from SD and then moving up to junior high school, then the dropout is increasingly high. And that's the same, like when you graduate from junior high school, the enrollment to high school is even lower. And one of the reasons, obviously one is the financial situations, but I think second also is the uneven distribution of schools. So a lot of schools were basically located still in the center of the cities. So if you live in the suburb, then it makes you basically become harder to access the schools. That is why I'm actually, despite I can see the merit of zone-based, the zonasi system, I'm actually kind of in disagreement with that policy because it actually alienates a lot of students who do not have access to schools nearby. So that's sort of the challenge. And I think going back to your questions, how then the media can basically contribute in the situation is that I think objective and fair education reporting helps the society to understand where the problem is, because sometimes we're being clouded. Even like when people see like Class of Champions and people start talking about, see, like we have so many smart students, like we like who win Olympiads and all that, but that's also like a very small minority, right? I think while it shows to show like a good examples, like like we still have like a great role models around us, and students who will be able to achieve great things in life. But then at the same time, I think fair education reporting especially will be able to showcase like we are still like dealing with a lot of different challenges that are urgent and requires a lot of public participation so that we are able to solve that. So that's the first one. But I think second also, like I think media can also play an instrumental role in showcasing a very good narrative, basically showcasing the success stories, like how people who were able to, able to attend good education, then have better opportunities in their life, and therefore create new role models. Because I think this is something that I've seen when I travel across the country, especially when I go to like rural areas. A lot of kids were like when we ask them like what do you want to be in the future, and then the answers are typically are basically the jobs that they're seeing in their in their village. So their exposure is very much limited to what they're seeing. So I think back to the question, how can media help this, for instance, is basically by showcasing that there are a lot of different options, there are a lot of different paths that they can choose from. And that's just one of the examples, I guess. Yeah.
No, that's great. I'll just like to add a couple of things, again, coming from a country which is also developing and in India. Overall, like nobody would disagree that, just the state of education, and as it continues to improve, it plays a huge impact on the societal development, not just like the financial and national development of the country per se, but how the country is kind of perceived, not only domestically, but also globally in the minds of, other countries. Like, when people think about, let's say, India or China or Japan or Germany, they kind of relate to a certain thing that, okay, Germans are great with engineering. Some of the countries, like for example, India is always good with technology or things like that. So I think it's just kind of also how the state of development of education helps from a domestically, of course, but also from an international point of view as to how the country is perceived in general, really. And I think just to add to the point which you made about the media part of the sort of angle into education, I think, with the access, with how everybody has currently at the fingertips with social media, some of the success stories which come out and through education, and like some of the show which you just talked about, Clash of Champions, even though that percentage might be very small, but it kind of provides a lot of hope and inspiration to a lot of people when they watch that. So I think that's the role of media in continuing to sort of showcase some of those success stories, which will inspire and sort of motivate others to kind of follow that path. And it may not happen immediately, but it kind of at least paves the path forward. Yeah. Yeah, so we'll move to the next question, and this is an interesting one, which is about the education state. And what we are going to talk a little bit about the current state of education in developing countries, and more specifically some challenges, differences between India and Indonesia. So maybe I'll just start that first, just to add a little bit of context to the sort of the Indian education system. So as I said, India is a very large country, 1.4 billion people. A very large part of that population is still young and sort of kind of growing. But in India, generally, the education and the literacy has always been at the forefront of all the governments in the past. So overall, literacy rate is like close to or more than 75%, and in some states is even close to 100% actually. But having said that, the problems still persist, which you were talking about, like, the quality of education, whether it is keeping in touch with the 21st century as to the kind of, how the world has evolved. And, are we still studying things which are probably never going to give you any practical benefit? I think that's a common challenge which everybody talks about, that, I'm studying something, but it may never give me what's the life lesson which I'm learning here. And when it comes to private education, people cannot afford it, and things like that, which are very common, and I think similar problems, I would assume. But the other thing which is also good about, some of the things which has happened in India over years is that the focus on education has always been around learning English language. And English has always been one of the a focus for, when kids growing up, parents always want their kids to sort of go to English school. And, that kind of has brought the society, and some of the big cities, if you go to India, most of the big cities, actually nobody speaks local language there, actually. Most of the people actually mostly speak English, and, that kind of is also represented in a large percentage of population of India can be found working in international countries like US and other countries as well. It has also, over time, has given rise to newer industries, like, for example, offshoring industries like call centers and business processing industries, where a lot of the work of companies in the US, etc., is done out of in India. So I think the focus of learning English and, kind of almost like as a first language has also been a good part, I would say, amongst the other challenges which the country in general in education has been facing. And I think just culturally, and which I'm again sure it's similar to Indonesia, is that the focus parents have, that from day one, you always want your child to become a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer or something like that. And that always continues to be there. And, as we see a lot of global successes where you have a lot of global companies where, CEOs are from Indian origins, for example, Google, for example, and things like that. I think that just, again, provides a lot of inspiration and motivation for younger people to sort of look to and aspire to become somebody like that.
I think kind of similar, and I kind of touch, that a little bit in my previous, answer before. But I think just another thing that I also have seen, especially I think post-pandemic, right? And with a lot of different changes that are happening at schools right now, with exam being abolished, and then again zone-based admissions, different type of exams being administered, and all that. I think what we've seen is that there is a significant decline in terms of students' motivation in general. So again, from the data that we have from our users, or from just anecdotal, so interviews that we've done with students and teachers, there is a significant decline in terms of their students' motivation. People feel why am I studying? Because later on, it's not gonna be tested at the exams, or what's the point of me studying this? Because after all, when I want to go to high school, there's no gonna be I'm not gonna be seen based on how I'm performing at school, but based on how old I am and where I live from the, how far I live from the schools, right? So I think those kind of things. While I understand why that kind of policy is kind of being set up, but I think at the same time, I think one of the harder challenges also how do you basically keep the students being motivated? How do you basically instill that learning? The learning and the growth mindset among the students, and going back to this topic, which is how media can play a role. I think media actually becomes a lot more instrumental than ever to shape that perception, so that students become a lot more motivated. So I think that's where I just want to add, because I think the rest is basically similar to how the situation is in India. Yeah.
Yeah, moving to the next topic. This is around how to engage youth, essentially. So what we are talking about here is what are the methods to attract younger generation to education and media sectors, people who are looking to build a career there or just to learn more about it, and also what are the effective marketing strategies with you for youth in this kind of field. So maybe you can start with from an education point of view, and then I'll add a bunch on media.
Sure. I think there are a few things that, and I'm just basically going to be speaking based on some of the things that we have done. I'm just going to show some examples. Next, okay. So these are just some of the examples, how we basically do things at Ruang Guru, right? How do we basically keep students engaged? Because I think naturally doing education is almost similar like selling medicines. It's not something that people organically, like or, want, but at the same time, you need it. So how do you kind of like package it in a way that is attractive to the students? So obviously you start from the content. How do you make the content become a lot more interactive, a lot more relatable to your audience, right? And the way we do it is that by not creating a one-size-fits-all content. So when we think about like students at the primary schools, and we think about like how do we incorporate animations, how do we incorporate stories? So that's why we create an animated feature called like Dafa and Lulu. It's almost like it's like a full pledge animation basically, but it's an educational content that is incorporated in the app. But then when we think about high schools segments, like the approach is a little bit different. Like people want something that is probably a lot more cleaner, a lot more straightforward, right? So just like how do you tailor it to your audience? The second one, and this is just this is one of the examples, right? When we do the namanya Legenda 8 Batu Sakti, it's basically like an animation feature, but it's basically talking about physics and math. And once we basically do that, we see a significant improvement in the median study time of our users. It's almost like 250% increase, which is like very, very much significant. So content basically matters. But I think second also how do you basically create a content, how do you basically deliver that content in a way that is engaging to the students. One of the ways we do that is by doing micro-learning. So we realize that when we deliver content, let's say in 1 hour format or like 1/2 hour format, people will naturally get bored. Because we're not only competing with other educational content, but we're basically competing with other things that they're seeing on their gadgets. We're competing with their notifications on Instagram. We're competing with their TikTok videos, with so many other things that will distract them, right? So therefore, like having like 1 hour video, like 1/2 hour videos would not basically do the job. So that's why even the way you chunk it, the way you divide the content, and that's what we call basically micro-learning, like chunking the content in a bite-sized approach so that, like the students will be able to chew that content in a much better way. And we do it in also like a personalized way. So it's not just about chunking, but then how do you deliver content that is relevant to your audience? The third one is obviously personalization, right? So how do you recommend the learning path that is optimal, that is relevant to the students so they are not distracted by content that is irrelevant? And this is just one stretch away, like how we basically even build personalization. Have you ever seen Bandersnatch, Black Mirror? So Bandersnatch is one of the episodes in Black Mirror, and it was quite revolutionary, when they basically did that, because the way it worked is that they try to personalize the content. Imagine like a film, like a short film, to their audience. So when you watch that film, you can basically interact and determine how the story goes. So let's say if there's an employee want to apply for a job, and then you can decide whether that person will get a job or not getting a job. And based on that choice, it will redirect you to different story paths. So that's what basically Bandersnatch does, and that's quite revolutionary back then, because all this time when you watch an entertainment content, is always like you're the recipient and you can't do anything about it, right? But now you have the control, you have the power to choose, where the story goes. And taking that inspirations, we try to do that and apply that in education, and creating like our own like sort of like a Bandersnatch version, which what we call Adapto. So students can even choose, which teachers that they wanna learn from, and based on where they are and their answers during watching the content, the path can basically even spread. But then the implication is that we have to create maybe 5 times or 6 times more content than what it used to be. So that's also a cons. So this is one of the examples, based on, so instead of creating just one single video, then the implication is that you actually have to create way more content than it should be. But then turns out, again, given the content becoming a lot more relevant to the audience, then the study time also increase, which then leads to better engagement overall. So I think this is just one of the examples, I guess, and how we basically play around a little bit in the education sector and try to apply different things that we learn from how media, conventional media especially, do their thing, and try to apply it like in education.
Great. Maybe I'll just take a quick minute to just talk about sort of how to get youth excited about the media industry. I think in general, obviously, everybody is a content creator nowadays, right? I mean, everybody has a phone and access to social platforms, so everybody is a content creator and almost like, working in a media company. But I think some of the learnings and, experience for myself and with the team at WISE, what we always had was, when you are creating content, the key thing is always being authentic. I think, that's the key word which we always talked about a lot. That once you start building trust and confidence with your audiences or whether with your partners or whoever you are targeting, is when you sort of start becoming more successful. So I think that's the key thing. And obviously, how to do that more of just to learnings through workshops, mentorship programs, etc. In some countries, even governments play a big role in doing that. There are a lot of grants and stuff like that, which is being provided to sort of attract younger people joining the media sort of forums, etc. And I think it's just a industry which has been evolving quite rapidly with the rise of social media platforms. And I think there is no barrier per se for anybody to become entering the media industry in general. Yeah. The next topic which we're talking about is sort of the media idealism and content creation, which is also a very interesting topic. It's essentially the principles that guide media into this role within the society, into like focusing on truth, integrity, social responsibility. And the second part to that question is, what are the sort of strategies for content creation that effectively merges entertainment and education, which I think Iman will talk about with that example which he shared earlier. And also related to that is like, the cost of production, the creative process of how content moves, etc. So I think maybe I'll just take the first part to start with the integrity part of media, essentially. I think the key thing, again, as I just talked a little bit about, like, there is so much information, so much news floating around every platform, on the phones, WhatsApp. WhatsApp is like its own university. So it's about what do you trust and what do you believe in, essentially, right? I think the part of authenticity, which is where it boils down to, and trying to create trust. And what we have been seeing, at least in the global sort of world, and especially in the US, that some of the traditional news media companies have started to do really well because people have actually started to realize that too much information to sort of, scrape through and trying to figure out what is right, what is wrong for them. So platforms like, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and things like that, even though they have become pay businesses over time, but people are willing to pay and move into that because at the end of the day, what people want is that as the society progresses and obviously economically you can afford it, you want that quality and the news which you can trust. So I think that's the really, really important part of how what we are seeing as a ecosystem of media develop from the Western worlds. And with social media, of course, it's not going away. Not that the content creation is going to reduce. So at the end of the day, there's going to be a huge amount of content. Independent content creators, like many people here, influencers on their own. I think at the end of the day, people should not be sort of chasing sort of clickbaits and just around the fact that just again be authentic, trustworthy sort of content. Which of course the underlying thing is that would you want your children to watch that? I think that's the kind of way to look at it, really.
Yeah, I think I'll just go with the second questions, given the time limit. So I think, how do we basically, again, blend the strategies in entertainment to education? And having done both films and education, I think what I can say is that, regardless of what you're doing, basically stories and narrative basically has a very powerful, like it's a very powerful tool to mobilize people. And I've seen how, like it also can change people's perceptions about specific issues. So last year I produced Budi Pekerti, a film that is directed by Regas Baduteja. And essentially it's talking basically about how a school teacher, a school counselor, got cancelled and basically went through that cancellations, right? And then basically it's now like basically every time we're dealing with someone who is being cancelled, that movie basically is brought up. And it shows basically how, film, for instance, how can basically shape how people think about a specific issue. And that can be applied also like in education, like how we do it like in Class of Champions, for instance. Taking one of the, I think I remember, like I think I listened to one of the podcasts by a producer from Pirates of Caribbean, and what he said was basically, if you put basically a boat on a storm, you get action. But if you put a boat on a storm and you put people on it, it becomes an adventure. And when you put basically people that you care about on that boat, it becomes a drama, right? And I think just using that principles, right? I think this is something that we're also doing like in Class of Champions. We've done previously, like I don't know how many game shows, how many like shows on TVs and all that, and it never worked the way it worked, the way Class of Champions worked, right? And I think one thing that we realize is that, like how do we basically make people rooting for these characters who are on the show? Yes, it's an educational show, but then at the same time, to make people stay, to make people actually believe in these characters, you need to be able to think about how do you make people care about these characters who are actually competing in the shows. And that's what we've seen, like people basically cry when, let's say, Maxwell got eliminated, or like when Sandy or Axel has to basically go against each other. That's basically not a setup, by the way. Like it was that way. I don't know what happened, but it was just like that. But that was actually what happened. And basically, like you start basically taking like an educational content, becoming something that is, dramatic, something that people start to care about, right? And I think that's just basically the power of narrative. So, and that's the same thing, when we do like, animation like Dafalulu, or other things that we're doing, it's basically using story as a way to deliver a complex subject so that people start caring about it. I think second, and the last thing that I just want to say is how you incorporate also like the influencer component into the strategy. So we've seen, how like influencers are being used like for medias and all that. And this is something that is actually very different between Indonesia and India. I know like in India, this star teacher concept is very, very common, right? Like you've seen like teachers who are very, very famous, who has massive followings, will have their billboards on the streets, and people they're actually celebrities. And this is something that we're not seeing in Indonesia for a lot of different reasons, right? We don't have like a star teacher that has like, I don't know, few million followers. We don't have that. And I think what we're doing now, let's say with Class of Champions, having that, like students who excel in what they're doing and then become teachers. That's also just another examples how like we make people basically start caring. Maybe when their initial intentions maybe like is different. Maybe that's because they are a big fan of these teachers. But then at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is that once they start caring about this character, start caring with these teachers, then later on they will have a like an interest in what they're saying as well, which is what we're trying to do. So that's it. Yeah.